And something I've noticed whenever I'm reading mainstream media, the Washington Post actually had a pretty the most detailed report I think I've seen about manpower issues and Ukraine. But even then, even still, even though they have a Ukrainian anonymous Ukrainian lawmaker say that the 30,000 or so Ukrainian troops that have been killed, that have been reported killed since 2022, even though they said it's a massive undercount, still the Washington Post fails to deliver any kind of estimate. But they are very quick to say that Russia has lost, and this, kind of boggles my mind when I hear this number, 300,000 troops, and they still push this narrative that Russia's military is in trouble. So how did Russia, this is an admission, Washington Post has admitted that Ukraine's manpower issue is a very real one and a very dire one. How did this happen? How was Russia able to accomplish this? And as you said that you had a tip that things are really going to change. How does this issue affect these developments regarding Russia's progress?
Well, the casualties are very closely held numbers for both sides, and the main reason is because of politics. General Christopher Cafoli, who's the commander of U.S. forces in Europe and the commander of NATO ground forces, back in January, February of 2023, was speaking at a defense forum in Sweden, I believe, and he said that the scope and scale of the violence that's taking place on the battlefield in Ukraine is beyond the imagination of NATO, beyond anything in NATO could possibly have imagined. It's the job of military organizations like NATO to imagine things, because that's how you plan the next war. You imagine what it's going to look like so that you have sufficient forces who are organized properly and equipped properly. If I finish World War II with a victorious army, and I say, we're victorious, my army's not going to change. And meanwhile, the world develops jet airplanes, nuclear bombs, but I stay the same, that army's not going to function very well on the battlefield. You have to have people not only preparing for what they know is going on, but you have to have somebody saying, hey, what's the battlefield going to look like in 2 years, in 5 years? What do I need to do to prepare for that? What kind of weapon systems do I need? How do I need to restructure my army? Do I want to stay in a triad system? Do I want to go to a square system? How many, is this the right level of manpower? Do I want an 11-man squad? Do I want to go to a 12-man squad, a 15-man squad? Do I want my fire teams to be 3, 5, 7? Things like this, that because how you structure it now is how you recruit for it, how you train for it, how you procure for it. All of this requires imagination. And what Cavoli said is NATO hadn't imagined it. Now, this is a huge concession and admission, because what he's saying is NATO's not ready for this kind of fight, that NATO's not organized for it, they're not trained for it, they're not equipped for it. They don't have the logistics for this. They can't sustain this level of fighting. So, when you have NATO drawing a blank like that, first of all, understand that 31,000 figure is just absolute crap. The Russians are saying, and the Russians are running very conservative numbers. The Russians are talking about Ukrainian casualties, in close to 400,000. But the fact of the matter is that's a gross undercounting. There's every reason to believe that the Ukrainians have suffered closer to 500,000 dead. And on top of that, you can add, 1 million plus wounded. It's a massive number. This is why the Ukrainians have the manpower shortage that they have, is that they've eaten through. When they started this, I always remember people, Ritter, you're making these numbers up. When they started the war, the Ukrainians had like 250,000, 260,000 regular forces, heavily armed, heavily trained, ready. They had border guards and other reserves that were another 300,000. Then they had, in the area of 400, 500,000 territorials. These are a different kind of reserve, sort of like the National Guard. But all in total, roughly somewhat less than 1 million men that were fighting. That's a lot. Those are gone. Where did 1 million men go? And remember, they've been recruiting and training. They're in there, they're in multiples of mobilizations that have taken place. And the point is that the battlefield is just grinding them up. Now, Vladimir Putin a while back talked about 10-to-1 casualty ratios. And the reason why it's important is that the Russians don't talk about their casualties, and they don't like people talking about their casualties. But let's just say that if you've suffered 500,000 dead and it's 10-to-1, that means the Russians have suffered 50,000 dead. But Putin isn't going to commit to a ratio that isn't related to the official numbers that the Russians are putting out. So if Russia is saying that they're counting, 400,000 Ukrainian casualties, and Putin is committing to a 10-to-1 casualty ratio, then we're looking at about 40,000 Russian casualties. That's probably dead. That's a lot of dead, but that's probably what we're talking about. Which means that if you go with a 2 or 3-to-1 wounded to dead ratio, 4, 8, 12, 16, you're talking about between 120 and 160,000 Russian casualties. Russia started this war with about 180 to 200,000 troops in theater. Now, since that time, they did a partial mobilization, 300,000, and then they brought in waves of volunteers, and the volunteers ended up numbering over 400,000. So if you've got, let's say, 200,000 plus 300, that's 500,000, plus another 450, you're up to 950,000 minus 180, 750, 670,000. I think that's the number people are talking about of Russian troops in theater before this most recent thing. Because Russia's, what's happening now is that they're getting 30 to 40,000 volunteers a month. Just to put this in perspective, the U.S. Army, which is 425,000 strong, had a recruiting goal of 60,000 2 years ago, and they could only get 45,000 people to sign up, so they're 15,000 short of 425. And the people who are supposed to imagine, they're saying, in order for us to do this kind of warfare in Europe and talk about Europe, we need to expand the U.S. Army by 150 to 200,000 men. We can't maintain the current levels. We tried to recruit 60,000 just to maintain the current levels. We were 15,000 short. The next year, we put the number up to 65,000 because we had now an emergency shortfall, and we were 10,000 short. We only got 50,000. So the end result is the U.S. Army had to reduce, I think, 24,000 billets. That means when you look at the table of organization, they had to go around and eliminate 24,000 jobs in the U.S. Army and say these jobs are no longer going to be filled. We're not going to recruit to these jobs because Congress authorizes an official strength. That official strength is based upon a table of organization. The table of organization lists every unit and every job in that unit. That's how we determine what kind of schools we need, because every job has a specialty. That specialty has to be attached to training requirements that go to schools. The schools are related, to equipment that's being procured. We're training people to fix this equipment. We need equipment for this. All this is done by a giant chart. And what the Army had to do is say, we got to go to that chart and reduce it by 24,000 because we don't have the manpower to do it. At a time when they're being told to fight with the Russians, you need to expand by 200,000. We can't recruit to what we're doing. The Russians, on the other hand, have a situation where 30 to 40,000 men are volunteering a month to join the Russian military. And they're training these people. So the 100,000 troops that are getting ready to come into the theater is on top of the 670 that are there right now. And this 670 is staying rather static. If you take a look at the casualty figures, the Russians today are suffering some of the lowest casualty rates that they've suffered for the entire war, meaning the Ukrainians aren't killing that many Russians anymore. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian numbers are spiking. The Russians are killing 800, 900, 1,000 Ukrainians a day. Now, Putin's 10-to-1 thing means Russia's losing 80, 90, 100 guys a day, but they're not. They're losing 50 guys a day. Now, that's a lot. Let me just put it in perspective. Again, in Vietnam, during the Vietnam War, at the height of the Vietnam War, we were bringing home 200, 220 body bags a week. and it broke America. Broke America. If the Russians are at their lowest casualty rate of the war and they're losing 50 guys a day, I'm just a simple Marine, but 50 times 7 days in a week, that's 350 body bags. That's more than we brought home during the Vietnam War, which broke our soul. Imagine Russia, a nation of 150 million, getting 350 body bags a week, or basically zinc coffins a week. And that's a good week. That's a week where they went, whew, we could have lost so much more. That's the reality. But so this is a bloody war. I don't want to pretend that it's not, but the Russians aren't suffering the casualties. And the other thing is, for all the casualties they suffer, they're being replenished. Again, I'm just a simple Marine, but 350 dead a week. Let's go to a 3-to-1 casualty ratio. That's 1,050, 350. We'll call it 1,400 casualties a week. In a month, 4 weeks in a month, that'll be 4,000, and then 4, 8, 12, 16, 5,600 casualties a month. So the Russian order of battle is being subtracted 5,600 casualties a month. Normally that would break you. I mean, that's a lot. They're getting 40,000 volunteers a month. So they're losing 5,600, but they're getting 40,000, which means they're gaining 34,400 a month. They're getting stronger every month by a significant number. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are losing, let's call it low figure, 800 guys a day. Now, they're not as efficient in their removal. The reason why their casualty rate's so high is they can't evacuate wounded. So let's call it 2-to-1, 1,600, 8, 2,400 times 7. We're getting into big numbers right now, times 4, even bigger numbers, too big for this simple Marine calculator to do off the top of my head. But you're losing a whole bunch of guys, and they're getting nobody. They're getting a handful of people coming in. So they're just getting weaker and weaker every day, and they can't reverse this. Sometimes a problem, they always talk about, you don't want to let a problem get to the point where it overwhelms you, because once it does that, you can't solve the problem. You're just overwhelmed, and you can't halt it. It's just going to fall apart. That's where the Ukrainians are right now on manpower. It's gotten to the point where there's nothing they can do to resolve this problem. Whereas the Russians are just an overwhelming, they're getting 100,000 more guys fully trained. Behind that 100,000 is 100,000 more, and 100,000 more, and 100,000 more. And they're being equipped with the best equipment. The Russians are pumping out 150, 200 tanks a month. The United States can produce 44 a month surge, not new production, refurbished. The Germans can produce about 150 a year if they have the steel, but they don't have the steel anymore because their steel plants have shut down because of the sanctions. So they can't even produce the tanks anymore because there's no steel to produce them. The same thing with the French. They can produce about 100 Leclerc tanks a year if they have the steel and the orders. They don't. The bottom line is the Russians produce more tanks in a month than NATO produces in a year. And the Russians, we talk about the problem with the Americans. The Russian army started off, this conflict, 900,000. Last year, in response to NATO expansion, Vladimir Putin authorized the Russian military to be expanded to 1.5 million. Now, some of that expansion would be done by increasing the number of conscripts. So what we saw is that, from let's say 125,000 conscripts per, Russia runs 2 conscription cycles per year. The number's gone up to around 150,000. So of the number that the Russians need, they're looking for about 50,000 from additional bodies from the conscripts. The rest of them, contract soldiers, which they're getting right now with the volunteers. 1.5 million. Last time the Russians reported, they said they've got it up. They've successfully brought this up to around 1.35 million. That's 1,350,000. And they're moving to get to the 0.5. But this doesn't include, and this is the thing that people need to understand, when we talk about the size of the Russian army, even that 670,000, it doesn't include a lot of the volunteer units. It doesn't include units like the Russian Guard, the Akhmat, the Chechen units, Special volunteer units, BARS units, things of this nature. Some of the LNR units, some of the DNR, Lugansk, the Donetsk. These are units and structures outside of the Ministry of Defense. Wagner, big news. Abdi Aladanov, the commander of the first Guard Corps, Army Guard Corps in Lugansk, the Akhmat Sila Chechen commander, just inked a contract with Rabator, famous Wagner commander of the first assault group, the man who raised the flag over Soledar, the man who raised the flag over Bakhmut. Robitar and 3,000 Wagner fighters, some of the best veterans in the Wagner organization, have signed a contract and they've joined the Russian Guard, and they're part of the Akhmat forces with Abdi Aladanov. These guys aren't part of that 670,000. So Russia's got close to 1 million people in this area, in this theater of operations, and they're getting ready to bring in another 100,000 with another 100,000, another 100,000. By the time the middle of the summer comes, Russia is going to have about 1.2, 1.3 million men committed to this fight. And that's all she wrote for the Ukrainians, because at this point in time, the Russians will be able to saturate the front line. The Ukrainians can't stop, and the Russians are just going to roll over and swamp them. And I think that's the direction this is going. But again, let's never forget, and the Russians will never let you forget, that the Ukrainian is one hell of a fighter. And they will fight hard for every square inch of territory. And if they are given equipment and they have the manpower to use the equipment, they'll use the equipment with lethality. So this isn't going to be a pushover. And I always tell people, when we talk about World War II and the American forces in Germany, the bloodiest month of the war for the United States Army wasn't June 1944, D-Day. It wasn't December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. It was April 1945, the last full month of the war. Germany was defeated. There was no chance for Germany to win. Yet this defeated German army, because it was fighting desperately on German soil, killed more Americans the month of April than any other month of the war. So we have to keep in mind that no matter what you say about the Ukrainians and the collapsing, anybody that expects the fighting to stop, you don't know the Ukrainians. The Russians know the Ukrainians, and they respect the Ukrainians.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiFong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.